this very special author interaction of the 2022 Nlf Reading Challenge. My name is Karthika. We're very excited to be here, and we hope you are too. The Nlf Reading Challenge is a 4-month-long reading event from March to June 2022, involving students between 10 to 13 years of age. It runs for participants on the competitive and the non-competitive tracks. We have students from across India participating in the challenge. In addition to fun book-based activities and regular author interactions, the challenge will conclude with a quiz competition that will see the 3 best teams win gold, silver, and bronze engraved trophies respectively, certificates of achievement, and a great set of books. Before we dive into the interaction, we just wanted to let you know to please use the Q&A box to type out your questions or your responses to what's being discussed during the session. If you're a student, a teacher, or a school librarian, please mention the name of your school along with your question as well. Today, we are privileged to have with us an author whose concern for the environment and the world around her makes its presence felt across her work, Katherine Applegate. She is the Newbery Medal winning and #1 New York Times best-selling author of numerous books for young readers, including The One and Only Ivan, The One and Only Bob, the Endling series, Crenshaw, Wish Tree, the Roscoe Riley Rules chapter book series, the Animorphs series, Willodeen, and the forthcoming Order. Today, she is here with us to speak about her book, Willodeen. Welcome, Katherine. We're very happy to have you with us today.
I am so excited to be here. I wish I were there in person. That would be extra exciting, but this is really wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. Complete pleasure is all ours. I'm sure our audience will be really keen to hear from you some more, Katherine. Would you want to do a reading from your book for us?
I would be delighted. Just happen to have one here. I'll just do a couple very brief chapters. I like to write books with very short chapters. And we will discuss that later. There's a reason for that. Once upon a time, when stones were soft and stars were bits of dust, I loved a monster. It seems forever ago, and perhaps it was, though things weren't really so different. True magic was gentle then and plentiful, but it's always there if you know where to look. The moon, after all, still smiles from time to time, and the world still spins like a dancer through the skies. In any case, the whens and wheres don't much matter. The earth is old, and we are not, and that is all you must remember. I suppose I always loved strange beasts. Even as a wee child, I was drawn to them. The scarier, the smellier, the uglier, the better. Of course, I was kindly disposed toward all of Earth's creatures, birds and bats, toads and cats, slimy and scaly, noble and humble. But I especially loved the unlovable ones, the ones folks called pests, vermin, monsters even. My favorites were called screechers. They screamed at night like demented roosters for no reason anyone could ever make out. They were grumpy as tired toddlers. They were sloppy as hungry hogs. And I guess there's no nice way to put it. They stank to high heaven. Get one riled and he'd slap his big tail and give off a stench as ferocious as an outhouse in August. And screechers were almost always riled. That'll happen when people are constantly aiming arrows your way. Screechers had needle-sharp teeth and dreadful claws. They had wild green and yellow eyes, 2 curly cute tusks, and more drool than a dog at dinner. They weren't big, about the size of a baby bear, I guess you'd say. Their bristly fur was plum-colored, and their tails looked like burnt flapjacks covered in quills. I was the first to admit that screechers weren't exactly charming, but I had a soft spot in my heart for them. Nevertheless, I'm not sure why. Maybe I knew a thing or two about being unlovable myself. Maybe when the whole world was marching one way, some ornery part of me started shouting, "Go the other way, Willodeen." You just gotta root for the underdog, don't you? And it sure seemed to me that screechers had always been the underdogs in nature's plan. Although rooting for cute puppies would have been a whole lot easier. Anyway, that's how it was. It'd take someone a whole lot smarter than me to tell you why we love what we love.
Thank you for that. I think it's always the final sentences in each of your chapters that really hit the point home for all of your readers. So thank you for that reading also, Katherine.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. It's funny, boy, first lines, last lines of entire books, but certainly even of a chapter are so important, and you can get really frustrated while you're trying to figure those out.
Yeah, but I mean, we can see all the effort that's gone in because it really stays with you.
I do like short chapters, as I was saying, because I think I'm sort of a frustrated poet at heart, and I'd much rather take a sort of a small rock of words and chisel away at it for a while and try to get that sentence just right. My husband is a writer, and he just, his books will be, 14,000 pages long, and he won't bat an eye. But to me, small is good.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much for sharing that, Katherine. I think on the subject of writing, what we wanted to ask you is, in Willodeen, there's the first person narrative that Willodeen shares with readers that we've just heard from. And there's also a third person omniscient narrative, which revolves around Quimby, which sort of talks to us and tells us about what's going on in Quimby's head and how does Quimby view the world. And so, it felt like it was an appreciation of what's happening in nature that we can't really know what's happening in an animal's head. And you've said that you like writing from a non-human perspective as well. So what was it that drove you to insert that narrative of Quimby into the story?
That's so interesting. It's a good question, because there is something very presumptuous about writing from an animal's point of view. I mean, by definition, you are going to be anthropomorphic, no matter how much research you do, no matter how close you try to hew to that animal's senses, for example. So I always feel, I always know I'm taking a big leap. And sometimes you go pretty far into the fictional world. For example, with the one and only Ivan, I did tons of research about gorillas, started writing it very much almost nonfiction, following the narrative of his life, as it were. But I found I couldn't tell the story well, and I needed to fictionalize it more and to some extent humanize it more. Now, in Willodeen, I tried very hard to keep those two things separate. And that close third person approach allows you to have a little bit of distance. So you're right. I think it's a good way to respect an animal's point of view while trying to get as close to it as you can. But it's a balancing act for sure.
Right, and it works so well. And for our readers who haven't yet gotten through all of Willodeen, there's a clue at the end of the book that tells us why is it that we get this narrative about Quimby from the perspective of the characters in the book. So we'll let you to discover that for yourselves if you haven't already. What really stood out to us about Willodeen as a character, Katherine, is the fact that she sort of approaches the world with the temperament of a scientist. She wonders about the world around her. She asks questions of it and of herself. She makes notes. She turns it all around in her head until the answer comes to her. She's really patient. And so I was thinking about how it would be really fitting for teachers to use that in classrooms to encourage and grow a similar disposition in their students. So is that something that's at the back of your mind as you write? Also, I can see that on your website, you have a bunch of interesting resources for teachers on how they can work with your books. So do you think about your books in classrooms when you write?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question, because I've had long discussions with fellow authors about whether they are writing for themselves or writing with their audience in mind. And I fall into the latter category. I'm thinking very much about what a middle grade reader might be worried about, might be thinking about, might be obsessing over. And I think that helps me cue in and know where sometimes to take a story. What I might want to read tomorrow is not what I think a fourth grader might want to read tomorrow, or a ninth grader. But in terms of this particular story, I very much had in mind the questions and concerns I've seen when I've done school visits from kids about climate change. It's omnipresent. You can't get away from it. You just look out your window. I happen to live in Los Angeles, and fire and drought has been a huge problem here. But you can go down the street and have a different problem. And so it's no longer something we can close our eyes to. And I've been just stunned and really encouraged by how well-informed kids are about climate change, much more so than their grown-ups. And I give teachers and librarians a huge amount of credit for that, because I think they've really introduced it into their curricula. So for this particular story, I wanted to touch on climate change in a really small sort of microcosm way, something where I could talk about species interdependence and address it at a village level almost. And I took it outside. There were so many climate crises I had to choose from. I really considered several real life scenarios. But at the end of the day, this allowed me to kind of step out a little bit and create a world that anybody, no matter where they live, no matter which particular climate issue they're dealing with, could hopefully relate to. As for the teacher guides, that is a wonderful thing that is usually, I very much am involved, but there are a whole bunch of people at Macmillan who help put that together. And they always have in mind what will work at various age levels and what will supplement what these kids are already asking about and have already read. But the thing with climate change, interestingly, is there's almost too much. It's very hard to know where to start. So one of the things this particular activity kit, I think it's at readwillodeen.com, I think it's available, focused on taking action, writing letters, making noise, because that's so much a part of what needs to be done.
Absolutely. So I'm sure all our teachers and educators and librarians in the audience will now go and check out the guide. We'll also share it out with them so that they have easy access to it. In your response also, Katherine, you've sort of responded to a question that one of our audience members had before you started speaking, which is about where do you get the ideas for your books? Do you take inspiration from reality, change into fantasy, or do you imagine the inspiration? And you've talked about that. We also know that in the past, you've responded through your work to pressing issues, such as when you wrote Home of the Brave, when there was an influx of Sudanese refugees to Minneapolis. You wrote Wish Tree during the presidential elections when the climate was really exclusionary. But something that we've noticed across your books, Katherine, a thread that sort of unites all of the characters, is that either their lead characters are sentient beings with magnetic personalities, or they're children who've experienced a lot, they've gone through a lot, they've experienced some sort of trauma, and they're holding a lot within themselves. But each of them sort of learns to trust slowly, they're keenly observant, and they also exercise agency on their own, in their own way. And in real life, also, you end up sharing a lot of material resources, articles on species that have made a comeback into the environment because of the work that conservationists have done. So across all of this, in your work with children for books, and in the material that you share and what you're concerned with, there are themes of healing and forgiveness and of a larger community that's being stirred to action. So do you think these are themes that you return to often in your work? And are these themes that resonate with you? Why is it that these themes resonate with you?
I have found, especially with reluctant writers, your teacher says, hey, I need you to write a story, and you're just sitting there drawing a blank. I often tell kids the best thing to do is ask yourself, what makes you angry? I find so often that I am drawn to topics that are infuriating me or confusing me or overwhelming me. And sometimes I can parse out some semblance of sense just by writing, not always knowing where I'm going. I mean, very often you don't know where you're going with a story, but finding elements of hope as I challenge myself that way. The catalyst for Ivan, for Wish Tree, for Otter, an upcoming book, for a lot of my books it often comes from the news, from an article I'll come across that will pique my interest. Wish Tree, for example, there was a family, they happened to be a Muslim family, it could have been any family, had moved into a small town in middle America, and somebody had put a note on their door that said, "Go away, we don't want you here." And it was just outrageous. And as you described, it was during a time in our country, and unfortunately, we're still having this problem where we were othering entire groups of people and not listening to each other. And the unkindness was just rampant. And I was so mad. I decided, rather than writing from a child's point of view, to write from the point of view of somebody who would have a longer worldview. And that turned out to be a 200-year-old red oak tree, something I'd never attempted before. And it brought up some challenges I hadn't anticipated. For example, trees don't move a whole lot. But it gave me this broad perspective on the changes in a community, the immigrants coming and going. And at the end of the day, after I wrote it, I felt better. So I often tell kids, write to figure things out. I think so often that's why I'm putting words on a page, just to help myself understand the world, because the world is messy and complicated and often overwhelming. And I think when you can, I can't imagine writing a children's book that isn't full of hope, because to me, that's the whole point of reading. And because I think children deserve that, because we're handing them a world and expecting them to fix it. And it's very important that we give them reason to hope and to think that they can change things, because they really can. There's a story I like to tell about Ivan. One of the reasons that if you're not familiar with this story, there was a real gorilla in a shopping mall in the middle of America, in Tacoma, Washington, who'd been shipped from Africa as a baby. And he spent the first couple of years of his life living like a kid. He slept with an 8-year-old boy, and he drank Pepsis, and he rode motorcycles. And eventually he got so strong that he was destroying this home, and they put him in a little cage in a mall for 27 years. And he had a little black and white TV and a chair and a painting of a jungle scene, and that was his life. And I was outraged when I read about it, and that's what caused me to start writing the story. But the interesting thing is, it was kids who got really mad about the way Ivan was being treated. They talked their parents into boycotting the mall, and they stopped going, and they wrote letters to the editor and the mayor and the governor. And it took years of litigation. The owners did not want Ivan to be freed, semi-freed, and that he was able to go and be with other Western lowland gorillas after 30 years. And it was that kind of lobbying that came from, 6-year-olds and 16-year-olds that made such a difference. So I think it's important for kids to realize they do have a tremendous amount of power, even though I know they sometimes feel so powerless. Look at Greta Thunberg, who is sort of, I like to think that Willodeen has a little bit of Greta in her, in that kind of, speaking truth to grownups way. And look at all the magnificent change she's accomplished.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so nice to see that connection between Willodeen and Greta Thunberg. It's really fascinating. So sorry, go ahead.
Katherine. Oh, no, I was going to say, yeah, she definitely was in my mind as a sort of model. And the other person I had in mind was Jane Goodall, who is like my personal hero, who is, if you're not familiar with her, a famous chimp researcher, a primatologist who lived for many, many years in the jungle studying chimps, just sitting there day after day after day and discovering they use tools and they interact like in social settings in ways that are very similar to humans. And that wouldn't have happened if she hadn't just sat there with a notebook and watched.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So much like Willodeen in that sense. So if anybody is interested in any of these, either of these personalities, I'm sure they'd be happy to check out the book as well. So since we were speaking about Ivan just now, Katherine, I also want to ask you a question from Shamita. Shamita D from Parikrama Center for Learning, member of our audience, who asked, why do you like to write about animals? We know that you grew up with a menagerie. There were always dogs, cats, gerbils. And so you've always liked animals. And we also know that you really like doing your research. You rented a cow while you were writing Home of the Brave. You've gone to...
Who knew you could rent a cow?
Really? You went and you observed the otter surrogacy program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium while researching your forthcoming book. What has that been like for you, for somebody who's grown up with animals, who's enjoyed their company, to be able to sort of look at them from a researcher's point of view and then fictionalize it for children?
Oh, it's like the perfect job for me. I have to admit, it's funny because I was not much of a reader when I was young. It took me a long time to realize how fun reading could actually be. And I think it was when I finally started reading books that touched on animal stories, things like Stuart Little and Charlotte's Web. And I went, oh, maybe that's why people like books so much. So I've always been an animal lover. When I was growing up, I was sure I was going to be a veterinarian. And I worked for a vet in high school. And I assisted in surgery, and I cleaned up a lot of poop, and I gave cats many, many baths. And then I realized that I was much more interested in what was going on inside their heads. And so being able to do lots of research and then transform that into sentences that I'm proud of is just like the perfect melding of my interests. For otter, let me see if I will show you this. I love this cover. This is the upcoming cover for let me see if I can get that a little closer so you can see. Isn't that adorable? For that, I started doing research with one story in mind. I live, as I said, in California, and all the way up the coast, there are sea otters. And this particular aquarium had been doing a ton of research, trying to figure out how to take abandoned baby otters and get them back into the wild. So I had a story in mind. And then the more research I did, the more the story veered off in a whole different direction. And that'll happen a lot when you do research. It's also a great way to procrastinate, I have discovered, something I'm also very good at. But it's really so much fun. Gorillas, for example, I knew nothing about gorillas except that they seemed terrifying. And the more I learned how intelligent and gentle they are, the more I was able to kind of create a persona for Ivan. So yeah, it's the best. It's my favorite part of the job, I think.
Excellent. I think if there are children out there who are looking for inspiration, then maybe they can take notes from what you said.
Oh, I hope so.
And since we just saw the cover for Order, Katherine, we also know that Charles Santoso is the one who designed the cover for, or he's done the illustrations for Order, and you worked with him on a bunch of your books in the past. What has that been like for you? And do you feel like this collaboration is something that you're going to do more of in the future?
Oh, I cannot wait for people to see his illustrations of baby otters. I mean, there's a quote in the book. Somebody said otters are the champions of cute, and they are. I mean, there's nothing cuter than a baby otter, but Charles has just outdone himself. He actually lives in Sydney, Australia. I have never met him. We just communicate on Twitter, but it's one of the most fascinating, the coolest part of my job, I think, is I create this manuscript, and then it goes to your editorial department. Those are sort of like your teachers and principals rolled into one, and they're the ones who keep you on schedule and help you, form your book into something coherent, hopefully. But then there's also an art department, and an art department has a stable of illustrators, usually tons of portfolios, and they sort of match make. And when I did Wish Tree, they knew there were a lot of animals in that, and they said, who do we know who just really does animals well? And Charles was perfect. So I do hope I can continue to work with him. It's such an amazing feeling when it's all in your head, and then you open up your laptop one day and there are these sketches from somebody halfway across the world going, hey, this is kind of what I envisioned. And it's what I envisioned, That certainly was true with the one and only Ivan. Bob the dog. Stan, do you mind? Do you want to make an appearance? I have a very grumpy dog on my lap here. This is Stan. And Stan was the model for Bob the dog and the one and only Ivan. And I said he was little, nut brown, big-eared, mouthy. And when I got the first sketch, I went, oh my gosh, that is Stan. It was so funny. It was like Charles had, in that case, it was Patricia, I can't think of her last name. Oh, it's going to drive me crazy until Castelleo, who had somehow channeled the perfect Stan. And then when the movie came out, Danny DeVito somehow voiced him perfectly. So now when I look at my dog, I hear Danny DeVito in my head.
That's very cool for Stan.
Yes, it's a point of honor for him, yes.
Nice. And for our readers, Charles Santos has also done the illustrations for Willodeen. So if you haven't checked it out, please go ahead. It's gorgeous. Really nice to see. We're sure you'll enjoy it. And one of the things that you've just touched on goes in with a question from Varsha Seshan, who's an award-winning children's writer from India, who asked you, how do you feel when your research takes you in a completely different direction from the one you imagined when you started the story? Does it make you panic? And you've just spoken about that. So thank you for your question, Varsha, on that.
Absolutely. Total panic.
Since we're almost ready to wrap up, Katherine, I think I'll just ask you this last question. And you've touched upon it earlier as well, where you said that you took to reading slowly as a child. And it really came down to finding the right book for you, which you said was books with animal characters. You've said in the past that Charlotte's Web was the book that did that for you. And you've had numerous conversations with parents, teachers, and librarians. What advice would you give for how the grown-ups in a child's world can help a child who hasn't yet found the right book?
Well, first of all, anything counts as reading. I mean, one of my favorite authors is Dave Pilkey. I love Dogman. I love Jeff Kinney. It's okay if it's funny or fun or a graphic novel. Maybe it's song lyrics. Maybe it's nonfiction. There are a million ways to fall in love with words. So understand that every child is different. And the road to finding happiness with books maybe not the same path that you took. And then to ask them, you can always say, what are you interested in? But you don't always get the answer you need. So maybe ask, what are you afraid of? Or what are you worried about? Or what makes you just happy beyond words? And sometimes those, slightly more off-center questions will take you to the place you need to get, because I think patience is so important. Obviously, even when you find a book you love, you have to have good teachers who will help, there are a lot of building blocks involved as you learn to read. But so much of it for me was just finding the right books. And I call them best friend books. There is a best friend out there waiting for you on the shelf. You just have to find it.
Thank you so much, Katherine. I think that's an excellent note for us to conclude our session. Thank you so much for taking the time out to do this with us. We really wish you all the very best with Order and all of the other work that's due to come out. We can't wait to read it.
Thank you so much. I've had such a great time.
Thanks so much, Katherine. Okay. Wish you a good day ahead. See you.
Thank you.